All right, good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this second panel. I think you'll see a lot of overlap between the discussion of the first panel and hopefully a little bit of continuation in a few of the threads and debates that they kind of began. Happy to be joined this morning by three great friends, scholars and people I respect tremendously. We have Bishop Garrison here in the center to my left. He's a graduate of West Point, William & Mary, most recently serving as Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Human Capital and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And before that, a long career spent on all sides of the Civ Mill struggles as a vet, NatSec executive, writer, and a member of several campaigns. Currently working on AI, which I understand is pretty popular. It's like the new ball bearings. Immediately to my left, Kori, Shockey, Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Before that, she was the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, raising the question of why you'd ever leave a job where your title is Deputy Director General. She's worked everywhere in government and taught everywhere that matters.
And you can't hold a job, is it?
And during all that, found the time to write 5 books. Among most popularly, Safe Passage, the transition from British to American hegemony, which, spoiler alert, I think it's really about China. So it's about China. And then last but not least, and the person we're all indebted to for putting together this great event is Heidi Urben, who is now the Professor in Practice and Director of External Education Outreach in the Security Studies program at Georgetown here. And so thank you, Heidi, for hosting us. She recently got out after 23 years, few combat deployments, Afghanistan, Bosnia, multiple tours in the Pentagon, which kind of count as combat deployments, and command of a military intelligence brigade. She focused on Civ Mill defense policy, has a great book, Party Politics and the Post 9/11 Army, which is tremendously impressive work. So it's wonderful to have them here, and I hope we can go fairly quickly into some of the flashpoints and topics of discussion that were teed up by the last panel. To lead, the title for this talk is Politicization of the Military and Pitfalls in Combating It. The first challenge is always being able to say politicization eloquently and quickly. It's the premier or one of the barriers to entry for Civ Mill scholarship. So before we get into that, I guess I'd like to ask the panel to provide a level set on definitions, right? What do we mean by this term, politicization, and how does it differ from partisanship? Is there a difference? What are we even talking about? Kori?
So I do think that's a fundamental question that we don't answer clearly and often enough. And it is impossible to be a leader of an organization and not be a political actor. And my favorite description of this comes from Elmo Zumwalt, who was the chief of naval operations during the Vietnam War. And he promoted, I think it was the first female admiral in the Navy. And when he put his epaulets on her shoulder, he leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek. And he writes in his memoir that he got more hate mail about that than anything else he did as the chief of naval operations. And his response to it was to write, "You have no idea how many cheeks I had to kiss to become the chief of the Navy. This is the first time it was a pleasure." And I think that I love that example so much because senior military people are political actors. You have to understand how institutions work. You have to understand the power structure and the levers to hit to get things done. Most human activity is at some level political activity, certainly in a professional setting. And that's normal. We actually want people who are good at that, people who have emotional intelligence, who can understand how to build a coalition, how to deal with members of Congress, when to hide behind your civilian superiors, and when to step forward and take a hard question for them. That's political activity. That's not scary. And in fact, we should want our military leaders to have that, because otherwise they're not going to have the sensibility to understand what are the president's political constraints on this problem, and how can I give her or him the kind of support that they need, the options that fit within their box. So that's fine. Political is fine. Politicization, I think, is on the spectrum towards partisan activity. And politicization is much more I'll give an example that I suspect my good friend Peter Fever might disagree with. I think an example of politicization is General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when testifying before Congress with the Secretary of Defense. The secretary was asked a question about critical race theory. That strikes me as a perfect moment for the uniform to let the suit handle this politicized question. And instead, General Milley, after the secretary gave his answer, couldn't resist the temptation to show off his Princeton education and give his answer to the question, which opens that up for everybody else in a uniform to be asked their view on that question. I think it would have been a better civil military move for him not to offer his view on the subject. But I hope we will argue about this, my friends, because this is the middle of the spectrum. And partisan, I think, should be easy for us all to identify. And that is endorsing political candidates, using your military rank for non-military purposes, particularly if you are running for political office or you want to put uniforms in an advertisement because that lends credibility to you. Or I even think politicization is having a television on in your military office, whether it is MSNBC or Fox News. The news landscape has become such a political sorting hat that I think that even for me feels like partisan political activity.
Thank you. The Bishop, want to follow up on that?
10 out of 10, no notes. Just copy off of her work. First of all, thank you for having us, Georgetown, and thank you to Dr. Urben. I greatly appreciate it. It's my honor to be up here with these extraordinary panelists, and our moderator are greatly appreciated. I do agree in large part with what Dr. Shockey said, and in some part dissent as we may from time to time, which I think is healthy. I think what you've described is a small p politics, which is incredibly important when we're talking about organizational health, when we're talking about having these types of conversations about good order and discipline, something we'll get into, I'm sure, to some degree in this, but being able to maintain unit cohesion and have these certain types of conversations around, well, what is good for the services moving forward? The small p politics plays into all of that. You cannot have flag officers that are expected to go up and speak on the Hill, to speak to members of Congress, to speak at committees that don't understand how politics works. So that level of politics, I think, is very healthy. When you start getting to the big P of politics and you start talking about Republicans or conservatives versus Democrats, progressives versus the far right, and in these types of conversations, that is where it gets much more murky. That's where it becomes a bit more clouded about, well, what is the actual political engagement that we're talking about here, and what is healthy for the services, what is healthy for the military. I believe that's when you begin to go into that trap of having partisan activity affecting your overall discussions about what is politically acceptable. And that's the problem that I have. Now, where I may slightly dissent, and we'll have more conversations about this, I'm sure, in the future, I only hope we can, is about Chairman Milley and his response to that. Well, I may not fully agree with the content of all that he said or the way he framed it. I think it is important at times to show from that level, from the flag officer level particularly, proper engagement with our civilian leaders on these types of very awkward, very difficult discussions. When something like CRT, critical race theory, is lobbed out there and used clearly in a partisan manner to have some type of divisive effect, I think it is important from a leadership perspective for our most senior leaders when it is addressed to them, to engage in these types of conversations and have a little pushback. We can argue on the edges about whether he went too far, whether or not the content was the right way to actually lay it out. But I think actually the engagement itself in that manner, in that stage, is very important for us right now, because we are a hyper-partisan society, whether we want to believe it or not. We do see that politics is being used as more of a sword than a tool at times. And we need to have these conversations to level set in a public forum and to show what true leadership and what true strength and values is about, and what the military has long strived to be about as a part of our society.
We're definitely going to come back to that. Heidi, your thoughts on level setting and the definitions?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I'd start off, I think the way that I'll frame my remarks throughout our panel is advice for senior flag officers on how to navigate this right now. And I agree with you that I think most people can understand what partisan is today. I'm not sure we still have a great understanding of what nonpartisan looks like in practice. And so I think when things are so divisive right now, it's understandable for senior military leaders to say, I need to stay out of politics altogether. I need to stay quiet. I need to make sure I don't say anything that could garner the ire of one of the two political parties. And what I would offer is, if you read no other book on this topic right now, read Mike Robinson's Dangerous Instrument.
Yes.
We are a paid political announcement for him, right? And in short, right, there's danger in the military construing nonpartisan as seeking out a mythical, equidistant point between the two parties that doesn't exist, first of all. And trying to occupy ground that is deemed to be unoffensive to either party. Because when one party moves to an extreme, that equidistant point moves along with it. So nonpartisan also doesn't mean bipartisan, of only talking about things that have agreement on both sides. Nonpartisan means not favoring or supporting a single party or creating the perception that you do. And so I think it's important for senior military leaders to truly reflect on what nonpartisan is, regardless of what's happening on either side of the spectrum.
We're coming back to that too. So, for years, right, Civ Mill scholars, the example we always used to love to go to was endorsements, right? That was the end all be all, the sky is falling. It started in 80, but then kind of grew with Crow in 92 or 90, 88 maybe, and then snowballed, right? Everybody took a pause and a breath in 2016 and then jumped right back in. It all seems pretty quaint now, but I guess, did that open doors? Were we right to be worried about it? And what did it lead to, right? How does that shape the landscape? And I'll start with Bishop, since he's written a lot about this.
Thank you. So back, I think it was 2018, I wrote a piece for Just Security about that I was a part of the problem. I just kind of admitted to it. I've been now on a staffer or senior advisor on 4 different presidential campaigns and have served in 2 administrations. In that one particular, in 2016, I think we had a very hard charge, a push to recruit as many validators, as many flag officers as we could to say, hey, Secretary Clinton would make the right president. She's the right person at the right time. And going back and reflecting on that in hindsight, I think that's absolutely the wrong approach. I think it brings our general officers, our flag officers, into a realm of politics that we would rather them not be a part of, because they are trusted advisors at such a high and esteemed level within government and within society. I think it's unfair to them when so many of them navigated their careers with the small p politics and were specifically asked and told not to get into the larger p politics of the situations. And I think it just sets the wrong tone, the wrong precedent, and it truly could lead to the absolute negative influence that we want them to have in these discussions. We should have them as trusted national security and foreign policy advisors for both sides, for all candidates when it comes to any type of political engagement. But when you say that for whatever reason, this individual, this candidate is not qualified because I don't believe he or she is going to be good on a national security perspective, and then they become the president. Well, what tone did we just set? And even more to the point, sometimes we've gone as far as to see some of these individuals demonize candidates on either side. And it's just incredibly problematic, and it sets the exact wrong tone for our overall force, is we have enjoyed a nonpartisan force for so long in this country. So I have some regrets, as we all do. I think I should have pushed harder for us to decouple that idea, for us to say, of course, we can have former veterans talk about what the appeal of this candidate or what they believe in them, but to have flag officers come out on a list and just in some cases we saw some flag officers that retired in the 50s and 60s, retired from service, coming out and saying why the candidate is a bad candidate. And it's like, well, does this individual, where have they been these last years? What have they been engaged in? How do they interact with the current national security and foreign policy community? I think that's a very important question. And sometimes maybe they haven't been for quite a while. So I think it's important to start framing the conversation more like that.
So I agree with everything Bishop just said about the deleterious consequences of high-ranking veterans doing political endorsements. It's become an arms race.
Yeah, the arms race. I'm sorry, I forgot that. Thank you.
And it's not at all clear it makes any difference, but it's a more problematic analysis for me than I think it might be for you, because the other word for veteran is citizen. Right? And the problem is not that these citizens do endorsements. The problem is that we in the public give outsized attention to their endorsements. And why should we care what they think about a political candidate? The person who had this most right of anyone I have ever known was President Bush, who in the spring of 2006, I was not in the White House at the time, but I was part of a history project that did a bunch of interviews on this. And when Greg Newbold and other retired senior people were complaining about the conduct of the Iraq War and complaining about the Secretary of Defense, senior advisors counseled the president that he shouldn't fire the Secretary of Defense because they were objecting, and that this would somehow be bad for civil-military relations. And the president's response was, treat them like any other political actors, that's what they are. And I think politicians are going to be tempted into this arms race for as long as the public thinks the military is a useful validator of it. So Shockey's theory of civil-military relations is that Mike Flynn may turn out to be great for civil-military relations because he's such a certifiable reckless idiot that it will remind my mother that she shouldn't be taking his advice on politics or vaccines or anything that he doesn't know any more about than any other American. It's going to happen. The incentives are just too great because my mom thinks people who wore a uniform somehow matter on policies that have nothing to do with their service.
Right. So it's that balance of selling your rank. I wouldn't even say it's an arms race. I'd say it's willing to be traded as like a Pokemon card, to the degree that you're undercutting the institution. And it's with what Admiral Blair was saying earlier. It probably relates, although not positive. The military is very respected, but in the Reagan survey, only 25% of Americans respect senior military leaders. And so it'd be interesting if there's a doctoral candidate out there to unpack that. But
be a good dissertation.
Yes, it'd be a great one.
If I could chime in
yes,
real quick
please,
on this one. again, I look at it from the perspective of those serving today and senior military leaders, and what do you do with this arms race that won't subside? My advice to those serving today is all bend under the broad umbrella of first do no harm to the institution and the profession. And the ones within the military profession that tend to do the most harm are retired flag officers here. And so somewhere we haven't done a good job, we, the collective profession, of deterring this from happening in the first place, using the peer pressure that Admiral Blair mentioned, and then the informal sanctioning that happens from within the profession. Some context is needed, and Admiral Blair hinted at that I think we estimate that there are about 7,500 living flag officers at any given time, and the vast majority of them don't do campaign endorsements and don't do that. So I wrestle personally with how do we assess the state of the norm today? Did the norm ever exist on deterring retired flag officers from campaign endorsements and so forth? We can see that it's on life support going back to 1988 or 92 and looking to today. How does the American public view it as a norm? I think, to your point, Kori, they pick and choose and say, well, these are, I have great trust and confidence with them when they're parroting back partisan messages that comport with our predispositions, and they're rabidly partisan when they don't.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And we saw that with, unfortunately, General Allen in 2016 at DNC. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so pivoting from that, right? So we've traditionally looked at it as political engagement at the senior officer level, but I want to continue with Heidi because now, right, the aperture is open and there's other avenues, right? We know that a brigadier general with a witty voice can reach more people via Twitter and social media than a four-star can giving a press conference in the Pentagon in the middle of the day. And that cascades all the way down to, the young NCO who just has a great insights into the military, can have a huge, huge following. What do we do with that? And how has that altered the civil landscape?
Yeah, great question. So I think Alice really hit it well on the challenge of how do you engage in a public space? Social media has absolutely changed discourse. We can talk about to what degree members of the active duty military have abided by a nonpartisan ethic through the years. The one variable is social media. I tend to think that there's been a constant state of eroding the norm of nonpartisanship, but now when you introduce social media to the mix, you amplify those voices, you leave a written, lasting record. And so in terms of what the uniformed military can do to strengthen the nonpartisan ethic, it's to not talk about rules as much as we can talk about norms, right? My fear is that we'll litigate this and we'll just create a bunch of regulations that you can and can't do this, when we should be having a conversation of, here's why you might not want to do that, even if you're allowed to do so. And that requires, though, a constant conversation about norms, which we don't do really well, and the uniformed military has gotten away from it. So I think when we look down and in, within the service, we have to reorient back to norms and teach it, and not just talk about the rule of splicing it, well, here's what you can do, but count, nested into, well, what should you do?
So, in the legal profession, they say hard cases make bad law. But we are making social media norms and regulations for the military by the hard cases. And the one that comes to mind is General Pat Donahue, who when, Tucker Carlson went after pregnant women in the force, right? A bunch of derogatory, nasty, misogynist stuff. General Donahue on social media came to their defense. And most women in service and female veterans that I know really appreciated that. It told them that the institution was going to protect them from this kind of scurrilousness. And yet it was a career-ending choice for him because what the institution saw looking at it was a senior military leader engaging in a partisan spat on social media with a major media figure. And this is going to create all sorts of bad norms and regulations, but it's also the right way to have the conversation, because there is merit in both of those views, and the institution has to tell its people how to navigate that space, even if that navigation changes with time. The attempt to avoid these, as Dr. Urben was saying, only makes the institution leave its people vulnerable. You actually have to take responsibility for what you expect people in uniform to do, and you have to do it on a case-by-case basis. And in my judgment, the Army leadership made, because they were fearful themselves, the political appointees, of taking spears in the chest over this issue, they left the uniforms to have to figure it out for themselves, and that's an abrogation, I think, of leadership.
I want to kind of split down the middle on this too, because I think in part it always comes back to the importance of the awkward conversation, but at this same point to what the end of what Dr. Shockey was just saying, that the political reality is that appointees still have to go up in front of Congress right now and talk about budgets and appropriations and authorizations and everything else. So the last thing they need is another distraction that takes away from either the resourcing discussion or from the actual operations discussion. And that in these topics that we're talking about are sticky and political, and they tend to be that exact distraction that no one wants to deal with. But I do think there's an importance in both framing it as a resetting of norms, like the should you be doing this? But we also have to remember how large our military is, and it's made up of a lot of young people from time to time, Joes, if you will, or Janes. And sometimes they need some guiding posts. And we need to do everything we can to give them that direction within reason, while also, and the and piece of this, teaching them, but should you be doing that? Should you? And because our ideal is for them to take it upon themselves to say, maybe I don't hit send on that tweet. Maybe I don't hit like on that Facebook post. But the reality is of it, if they do it, we need a mechanism to address that type of behavior. So.
And a tolerance for when they have it wrong.
Yeah, people are going to make mistakes.
They're going to do it wrong a lot.
Yeah.
So this discussion leads again to, we've talked about it in the concept, we always like to talk about it as in elections because that's a great little partisan example, but we see ground shifting. And the question, Kori alluded, Dr. Shockey alluded to, right, what happens now when you have partisan actors who are reaching into the military for political gain? And I want to grapple with a little bit, there was an archetype or an example that that Admiral Blair brought up in the last thing about, this pining for the good old days when I could be told, go to Europe and conquer the continent and report back when it's done. And the assumption there, obviously, is that military effectiveness is a settled question. Setting aside the last 20 years of war, when we talk about military effectiveness, sometimes there's competing concerns that all of a sudden can become political, that we can't divorce. Specifically, right, what we think are settled questions re-enter the partisan fray. Dr. Shockey, you mentioned, right, all of a sudden we have outside actors relitigating the idea of women in combat. Right? So they're there. How do you deal with that when all of a sudden somebody says, actually, no, the military has it wrong. They shouldn't be there. On the other side, the military itself has said, well, wait a minute. Part of our effectiveness maybe means that we should no longer celebrate the lost cause, and that we need to remove adoration of men like Benning, middling generals who are wild segregationists and racists. Maybe we should move them out of the canon of who we commemorate, but now all of a sudden that's a political issue. So feel free to engage with either of those, but what do we do?
The easy stuff, man. Wow. Who wants to? Okay.
How do we define effectiveness?
I can take the latter piece of what you're discussing, and boy, I'm going to try to get through this minefield. So, as a part of my responsibilities while I was in Secretary's front office, it was being a liaison to the naming commission and just really listening to what they were doing and reporting back, not taking any active role, to be clear, in this stuff. But I think a part of the point you make is, look, like when we actually look at the numbers of representation, particularly of ethnically and racially diverse individuals in the United States military, in the all-volunteer force, as they raise their hand, in 2021 was the most recent profile data that was available. In the Army alone, you're talking about almost 20%. 1/5 of that force is made up of African-American people alone. So to be that young soldier, as I was once, and to go to a base that has been commemorated for someone who would rather, quite frankly, see me in chains or see me in some type of subjugation rather than be an officer in the United States military, that has an effect. It does. And it doesn't mean that is something wrong that you have done as a white man in your time here in the present. It doesn't mean that you bear the burden, it's your responsibility, but at least acknowledging that is a fact, that is something that could affect me or have some type of ongoing effect on my mental state or anything else is important. Just having that level of empathy as leaders is something that we really need to re-engage in because it is a part of our American values, it's a part of our core values. So I do think that it was an important move for Congress, because it was a congressional committee that was established, to go back and look at these names and talk about these commemorations. And for us in the 21st century as a nation to have this discussion, it is another awkward conversation we don't want to deal with. But we have dealt with so many incredibly difficult things in our past that this is important. I mean, it's just a reminder that diversity within our military goes all the way back to the Continental Army. It goes back to the American Revolution. We just didn't start putting black men and Asian men and women in the services in Korea or Vietnam. Like, we're talking all the way back to Crispus Attucks. So I think that piece of it is important.
So I have two observations on this, one on your first and one on your second. On the first one, Congress really runs the American military. The American military doesn't. And there is simply no substitute for winning the political argument on these issues. So, Congress can decide women can or cannot serve in combat. Congress can decide that the don't ask, don't tell policy is no longer suitable for our society. So these are properly political questions, and the military can and should make its case for what they believe should be done. But going back to, are you a political actor? You have to have the ability to persuade Congress why what matters to you is actually important for the force, and you have to win that political argument. So that's the first observation. The second observation, I was on the commission that renamed military bases and capital ships. And yesterday, the USS Chancellorsville was renamed for Robert Smalls, who escaped slavery by stealing a Confederate ship and taking a whole bunch of other people to freedom. He served in the Union Navy during the Civil War. He was a brigadier general of he integrated public transport in the city of Philadelphia. He served as a brigadier general in the South Carolina militia during Reconstruction. He was a 5-time member of Congress. To suggest that commemorating Robert E. Lee's tactical choices at the Battle of Chancellorsville is somehow more inspiring than young Americans wanting to grow up and be Robert Smalls seems to me not a hard call. And it hasn't been. We actually have not gotten a bunch of blowback to the choices that we made, in part because the process that we went through was respectful of what communities wanted. We went and talked to communities. We did a bunch of research about we made decision rules We wanted to choose people that soldiers could draw inspiration from, preferably Medal of Honor recipients, preferably from recent conflicts, and preferably from communities who had been overlooked in previous rounds of this. And everybody always asks, didn't identity politics drive all of this? And there is one really important case where identity politics made the decision, and that was the choice of Fort Liberty for being named for Fort Bragg. And the identity politics that drove that was that the Special Forces community, which has part of the base, would not tolerate the airborne troops having it named for an airborner. And the airborne folks would not tolerate a Special Forces person. Identity politics takes lots and lots of forms, my friends. It was for me, I had thought that being on the commission was going to be so crummy and so political, and it was in fact incredibly inspiring about the number of Americans who we can and should celebrate, whom we have overlooked.
Highly recommend the report just for that reason. Just a list of names for consideration were truly amazing. And thank you for explaining Liberty. I did not get that one at all.
That's the identity politics choice.
Heidi?
Yeah, if I could add too, before the unfortunate word woke entered our lexicon, it was the discussion of should the military be a social experiment or not? And the problem with that debate, as with the debate today, is that it settles on a false binary choice, that you can have a military that looks like the rest of America, or you can have a military that's lethal and ready. And this goes to your point on military effectiveness. Well, all sorts of things go into military effectiveness. I think the war in Ukraine has given us a great tangible example of what makes for military effectiveness. And while quantity may have a quality all of its own, there's a little bit more than what goes into that. And if you don't believe us, trust the social science and look at Jason Lyle's wonderful book, Divided Armies, that I think answers this question fairly authoritatively, right? That militaries that have good cohesion tend to perform well under stress on the battlefield, and militaries that are riddled with inequalities and have a lack of cohesion tend to perform poorly on the battlefield. And so I think that also is how the military can better answer those questions to political overseers, to give better tangible examples of what goes into military effectiveness.
Exactly right. The ballerinas and transvestites of the Ukrainian military are kicking the ass of those macho Russia guys.
Thank you, Kori. We'll take a few quotes from the conference. It's in the running. How do we address these? Can norms do it, and who has to take the lead on these? We opine or we pine for an educated public that's willing to read the National Defense Strategy versus listen to what Tucker has to say on Fox News, right? Are we barking up the wrong tree? Is it wishful thinking? How do we get at this?
I'll take a stab to start, and I know a lot of my answers will be unsatisfying here, but there are three groups that contribute to politicizing the military: civilian elected leaders and politicians, the American public, and the military itself. And the one that can repair damage is the military, because we can teach and inculcate norms better, we can reorient and so forth. But fundamentally, this is going to require politicians and civilian elected leaders to do better. And they have not been incentivized to do so yet. I give the widest berth to the public that takes their cues from elites, both on the military side and civilian side. And as polarization seeps into the American public, they're going to be guilty of the same things that we see among our politicians. So the public will start to have more informed civ-mil attitudes when they see that demonstrated on both the military side and among civilian and elected leaders. This doesn't mean, though, on the military side that work doesn't have to be done, because norms have deteriorated and norms can die. And without constant teaching and reinforcement, you can't bring a norm back from life support. So there's still work that has to be done within the uniformed side. But I'm most optimistic that that's the side that can repair and reinvigorate norms. I'm less optimistic on how do we deter bad behavior on the part of civilian elected leaders and politicians here, because they're incentivized to continue to behave in this manner.
Go ahead, Bishop.
I was going to say I tend to agree with everything, and I would say even from a more basic, fundamental perspective, we've got to get back to teaching more civics and social sciences at a middle school, high school level within the United States. I love STEM and STEAM. I think that it's amazing for us to continue to think about future technologies and how we're going to build out our competitive edge here in the United States as we talk about competitiveness with both our allies and other foreign entities. But if we're going to be able to really move the country forward and to get a better understanding about politics, about all of these public policy issues that are taking place and taking shape right here in front of us, we have to have a better understanding generationally understanding of just the basics of how the country should function, that politics should not be a competitive game, that it really is about the totality of society and how we can do everything we can to support each other and support this shared growth that we need to have in order for everyone to be more prosperous. And I think we have kind of lost the thread there. So to me, if we can get back fundamentally to a part of that, I think understanding the military's role within that society it becomes all of a more clear picture.
I agree with both my colleagues' judgments on this, but I actually think those of us in this room need to do a lot better at educating both lawmakers about the damage they're doing to norms and the public. The military, our tendency in civil-military relations is exactly as Professor Urben said, which is to get the military to solve this problem because they have the coercive tools and the positive culture to be able to affect military attitudes. And I take her point that the military has work to do. But compared to the other two actors you're identifying, the passivity of the American public on these issues, it's a natural occurrence almost 50 years into an all-volunteer force, but it is also pernicious to civil-military relations for my mom to be so ignorant on this. And mostly it is the assault by elected officials, whether it is a president asking whether this is one of my generals or confirmation questions that go to military leaders that are intended to draw them out on political issues, or whether it is the President of the United States issuing pardons to war criminals that the military justice system had come to condemn. We're the people who shape public attitudes on these issues. We're the people who testify before Congress, who write op-ed pieces, who get asked by political candidates for endorsements or to work on their campaigns. And we actually need to be a lot more active on this because exactly as my two colleagues suggested, these norms, they're not eroding. Trapdoors opening underneath these chairs, and we're all going to fall into a sewer if we don't actively work to shape this culture.
If I could real quick, the one way that we might get civilian elected leaders' attention is one of the net results of constantly politicizing the armed forces and its senior leaders isn't just going to be that the public starts to lose confidence in the military because they see the military as a partisan actor. But senior military leaders will lose trust and confidence if they haven't already in all civilian elected leaders. They will paint them all as, I can't trust any of you. You're always going to politicize us. And I would think that would get bipartisan agreement that this would be something to cause elected leaders and politicians to refrain from that. But it's an uphill climb.
A couple of concrete examples of things that legislators could do. First of all, the leadership of armed services committees could read the questions that their colleagues are submitting for answers to the record and collegially ask for some to be excluded or to be answered in private would even be an improvement. Second, Congress could legislate that TVs should not be in military offices. You could find other ways to get information other than having Fox News or MSNBC blaring, because these are taken as political signals, whether or not they are intended as them.
So we're about to open for questions, but I want to run through this trapdoor. This idea that maybe norms aren't collapsing, but maybe they're done. And I'd like to read you an email I recently got. The title is, "The military is no place for woke politics." The sender is a colonel. I'll leave out his name, but he puts colonel right in his signature line.
As one does.
As one does. And it says, "Jason, when I saw what was being taught at our military academies and training facilities, I was absolutely shocked, Jason." It's a very personal email. Critical race theory, woke gender ideology, liberal revisionist history. It sounds like a nightmare, but unfortunately it's the truth. The woke left is poisoning our military, and it's up to us to stop them, et cetera, et cetera. Give me some money. Jason, the consequences of teaching things like critical race theory in our military are life and death. It's not just bad policy, Jason. It's an outright national security risk. Please give me some more money. Thank you, Colonel X. And at the very last line, I'm a congressman. I would submit that this is a singular example, and it does go a little bit into the question of, where do we treat reservists? It also highlights the question of, he's not identifying as a reservist, and the American public doesn't know who's retired, who's active, who's reservist, who's not. This might singularly indicate that both the idea that we're going to inculcate norms in the military is a failure, and then that we're going to inculcate norms or prevent opportunists from opportuning in the civilian side is dead. So what do we do with this? What if we say the cat's out of the bag, the floor's fallen? What does it mean to have a military at 40%? What's 40% approval, or that gets beaten back and forth and shifts with the winds? What does it mean if we all of a sudden have generals appointed like cabinet secretaries? Is that bad?
Yeah, can I start? I want to tell you guys a secret. This is something I really never talked about that much in public, but as I was personally being attacked as a quote-unquote woke critical race theorist, during my time in DOD, I had no idea what in the hell critical race theory was whenever that first happened. I had never heard of it. And it was because I was never taught it at the academy. I was never taught it back in Lexington, South Carolina, where I was born and raised, because it is taught at, as I understand it, at a legal, I never learned in law school either, but it's taught at that level, a graduate level, and it is a very nuanced type of theory. So, I mean, first, we have to understand and recognize that this was the red herring, the political football, that it was meant to be a political tool. And I would hope that we don't overcorrect as a society when we're taking into account and then thinking through the potential policies and the way we engage these types of issues, to use CRT specifically as the guiding principle example of how we need to address it. But on the other hand, though, I think we maybe perhaps have fallen through a trapdoor when it comes to these types of issues, and it's time for a new paradigm. Like, how do we rethink the entire idea of political engagement in such a hyper-partisan environment? Because I think to some of the points that we've made, like simply asking individuals to hold themselves accountable and to not send out those types of emails that has your rank on, and maybe you forget to put the R next to the old colonel rank or lieutenant colonel at that time, and it confuses or misleads people. That's problematic. Maybe you are still in the reserves, but in your official capacity, you're a member of Congress, and you still send out things like that. That is problematic. So I think we have to rethink how we're going to address some of these things, while also understanding that we're at a very critical point, pun intended, in history, to be able to come through and engage thoughtfully on this type of policies.
So first of all, that was a terrible pun, Bishop.
I didn't get any laughs, so maybe it was there.
So in the specific example you used, Jason, that actually is regulable, right? Because he's a member of the Guard and Reserve, and you could actually regulate the ability to use uniformed pictures of yourselves for non-military purposes, for fundraising purposes. And actually, I'm super grateful you used that example, because Bishop and I are doing some writing together on this subject, and that's a good one to use. That's a concrete thing Congress should fix. It may even also already be the case, and here's the second part of it, though, which is the Pentagon, the military services are very hesitant to enforce the actual rules against people who are politically salient, right? Lindsey Graham, what's her name? That awful, come on, white streak in her hair? Tulsi Gabbard.
Kori.
There are regulations on the books that, because they don't want to look political, they won't, in a nonpartisan way, enforce the existing regulations. And that is something we should fix. The military services need to be brave enough to live their own rules and regulations, even when it draws you into political space.
Wonderful. Heidi?
Yeah, great thoughts all the way around. I would say to the last point Kori made, is this need to steward the profession, regardless of what's going on to the left and the right. And it's to truly have that understanding of what nonpartisan means, and to be able to stick to your guns and to enforce it, and to enforce violations, and to enforce violations when they happen on both sides. And you're right, that the tendency can be, I'm just not going to say anything because this is a misunderstanding of what constitutes political as opposed to partisan or nonpartisan. On your point, Jason, about what do we do if trust and confidence goes back to 40%, we have a panel that will speak to this, but I will intrude a bit on it, and I'll say it'll look like the 1980s, right? When in the era of the Reagan buildup and a 780,000 person army, trust and confidence was probably around 50% or so, not in the 80s that we saw in the post 9/11 wars. I'm not rooting for trust and confidence to take a dip in the military. I'm rooting, frankly, for trust and confidence in other institutions to rise and to normalize a little bit. So we don't have one that we pedestalize and every other we disdain, because that, I think, puts us in all of the dysfunctions that our first panel talked about today.
Can I go back on just one thing that both of you kind of hit on? If we're going to have the services be able to properly police people that step out of bounds on these types of political issues, we as civilians, as a civilian leadership, have to give them the proper space and the proper umbrella cover to know that they aren't going to have any negative ramifications from that. And right now, that trust doesn't exist, I think, is a part of the main problem here too.
Yeah, or everybody wants to be treated like a professional until it's time to police and account the profession, right? I mean,
there's even a way, though, that I think senior military leaders can professionally and with humility make corrections on their civilian overseers that's not done for partisan gain. And the one I always share, several I know others kind of point this out, look to Australia for a great example, right? If you haven't seen the video, it's a 2019 video of Chief of Defense Forces General Angus Campbell. They are flanking the Minister of Defense in a press conference, and suddenly the questions have turned to a more domestic political nature at a partisan tone. And he very quietly, very unobtrusively, whispers to the minister that we're going to step aside right now so as to not be a backdrop here. And that is a great moment of political awareness. It's a moment of moral courage. And it's a great moment of humility to do so in a way that doesn't further offend and tweak your civilian counterpart. So there's a way that it can be done.
That's a great example. So I think we've solved everything, but if there are any questions, anything we didn't address.
In the unlikely event we've said anything you might not agree with.
Yeah, I know. Please come up to the mics. We've got about 18 minutes, so that's time for quite a few questions. Well, it's enough time for questions, maybe not statements, but.
Oh, so I can't do my manifesto.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, my name is Mary Quinn, retired executive for the Department of Defense and Army officer. And one of the things that I've noticed over the course of my several decades is the change in senior military officers having to testify in Congress. And I think, Dr. Shockey, you mentioned that people having a manifesto as far as, I'm just going to ask this question and make this person squirm. That it's not really a relevant question, that it's just they want to do their manifesto. How would you prepare senior officers to respond that is a respectful way to, but not engage, knowing that they probably will take some shots, but what would be the best way, do you think, for them to engage?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I need to give some thought to. That's the answer, right? That's what they should do. That's a really interesting question. I need to give that some thought. There are all sorts, every college professor knows that, students are smarter than we are and they're going to stump you. And so I think the key, which like so much in military life, is don't have the first time you think about it be when you're doing it in combat, right? And so think about, Jim Mattis was great at this when he was defense secretary. He would get asked about football players kneeling during the national anthem, and he would say with humility, I have a really hard job that I'm struggling to keep abreast of. I don't actually have a view on that subject. And that's an okay answer to give. You're still going to get kicked around for it, but you're going to get kicked around less than if you offer an answer that's actually going to create vulnerabilities for the institution or for your colleagues.
Can I add one thing to that? I think a problem as a part of this too is the culture, because at least from my perspective, and maybe it differed from others in the room here, as I went through training, it was that you always fake it until you can make it. Like you always have the answer. as a young JMO and then coming up through the ranks, the worst you can say is I don't know. So once we get to the flag officer ranks, of course, they're going to always want to be the ones to deliver that answer and have an answer. But I think there is a lot of value in what you're saying, is that maybe we need to rethink that and have them say, I have other things on my plate. I have not considered that. I just don't know. And that is an answer, and that is absolutely an acceptable answer.
I would also always look for an opportunity to take it off camera. And so maybe that needs to be a preemptive act where you can anticipate where some bad faith questions might come from, and you have to answer them, right? It's not going to be the military's role to decide what is bad faith and what's not. You have to answer what you're asked, right? But it might be worthwhile to seek out some office calls before you're going to be under the camera lights. My guess is somebody who's seeking to score political points might behave differently in their office over a cup of coffee than when all the cameras are on. And it may not change matters, but it's another tool, I think, that can be done along the way.
And a willingness to engage. We have Colonel Dr. Wharton over here on the left, sir.
Good morning, Chair and Warden. Thank you for the panel. This was wonderful. I'll introduce myself as an Army Colonel, Bishop, as one does, I guess.
Be Navy. Be Navy.
As we consider the polarization in broader American society into red and blue communities, I was wondering if you could speak of the implications for recruiting in those same communities.
I'm sorry, the implications for what?
For recruiting inside increasingly polarized red and blue communities.
Yeah, so it goes to Professor Urben's point about trust. The couple of observations on this. First, in the Reagan Institute poll, a large number of people who reported diminished trust in the military said in the follow-up question that the reason was because of politicization, a critical race there, all these pressing social questions. Military recruiters say that's actually not a problem. Like, nobody asks us, am I going into a woke military? Where the disconnect exists, I think, it may not be that the 18-year-olds or the 25-year-olds who are being recruited, that's a major thing, but it is for parents, guidance counselors, and it comes into the equation there. There is only so much you can do to shield a military from the politicization and partisanship that's going on in broader society. And virtuous as we may think it is to have a military perfectly insulated and hermetically shielded from that, that's actually kind of a creepy outcome too. And historically has a tendency towards feeling like they're, a Praetorian Guard at a bacchanalia, and that's not a good outcome either. So it's problematic all over the place. One thing that is my personal jihad is that when people say all this wokeness in the military is going to hurt recruiting, what they mean is that we're recruiting people who are comfortable with the existing affronts to diversity in our force. And I think we need to ask, is that who we should be recruiting? Because a lot of the recruiting infrastructure has a tendency to go to where the recruits are, which makes perfect efficiency sense. But efficiency shouldn't be the metric for this, because we want a military that continues to reflect the crazy dope smoking hippies of my beautiful Northern California, as well as we want it reflecting Bishop Garrison. So, there's not an easy answer to it, but I don't think we can I actually think the military is doing a really wonderful job of navigating an intensely partisan moment in American politics, but we're just going to have to fight it through. I don't know any other way to do it.
Yeah,
what do you guys think?
Yeah, sure. Just one thing I'd add on that, and we haven't had a chance to discuss this, but on that Reagan Institute survey, there was also, I think, a sample size that was fairly conservative. When you go back and look at the numbers, which plays into a part with some of the responses that you get in it. But more importantly, I think your point about the broader society and what's happening was playing that's a huge point, because we're all humans. Like our recruits, the people we're pulling from are human beings, and they're seeing what's playing out in the news. They're seeing how the military is being attacked by elected leaders. They're seeing the types of debates that are taking place right now, and that does have a broader effect, and it's something my dad was Vietnam, plus his heart, he's gone, was a Vietnam draftee and got a Bronze Star in Vietnam and came back to a country in the Deep South that was barely getting out of the civil rights movement. It would take decades later for him to receive equal treatment, but that is a reality that exists. So when we see what's happening to, frankly, young men of color in today's society, young women of color, we have to understand that the recruits that we're pulling from are affected by these things. And it's going to have an effect on whether or not they want to step forward. And that's without talking about the economics of it, about what's happening with businesses, and that we're having a competition for talent. And that, frankly, for probably too long now, we've relied in some part, no small part, on a warrior class to pull from, meaning that you're more likely to serve, like I was, if a family member, particularly a mother or father, had served before you. So I think all of these different pieces kind of play into it. And then you start looking at the discussions about blue versus red states and what we're seeing with one particular elected official right now, and how that's being framed as the potential for a national divorce and all of these other things. Like it really plays into and has, I think, a detrimental impact, unfortunately, on how we're able to recruit and retain.
You know, one thing I would offer too is the only reason why I think those uncles and parents and guidance counselors, why this debate thrives today, is today's military is less understood and considered and known as it was in past years. And this goes to your book, right? The large percentages of respondents in your survey who answered, I don't know, or I don't have an opinion, I'm just not sure. So that debate thrives on a military that's not well known. And again, not to put it all back on the military's shoulders on how to kind of navigate this, it needs to be addressed and spoken to in the way that the public needs to better know its military. One thing I would suggest is that senior leaders not embrace the term woke, because that's a partisan term. And if you're a nonpartisan institution, don't buy into a partisan term, but answer the questions, right? Answer the question, well, let me talk to you about today's force and what we're doing, to hopefully put some of that to bed.
Over here on the right.
Hi, my name is Alessandra Nish. I'm a lieutenant commander in the Navy, and I'm a student here at Georgetown. So I just wanted to talk to a couple of things real quick. One, I was one of those females in a flight suit when Tucker Carlson came out with his comments, and I was also the senior female leader in my command, as has often happened, where everyone else stands back and waits for me to say something regarding, oh, it's women's stuff, like, you got it. And that happens a lot in leadership of, hey, this is this minority's issue to deal with, or this is this, you know, and without having any senior leadership to look to and say, somebody come at, like, boss up here and come up with an answer and give me ground to stand on without me having to stick my neck out and be the one to make the political or partisan statement here. It shouldn't have to be on all of the mid-grade officers or anyone to be that person. But I will tell you, walking into my office after George Floyd or after some of the different things that have happened in our society, those sailors, the military profession that we're talking about, this all-volunteer force, has volunteered to put their life on the line. And these are, 18-year-old kids signing up to go serve in Afghanistan, which started before they even, were born. This conflict had started before they were even born. So we're talking about people that are willing to put their lives on the line, and they want to know that there's some support for them. They want to know the country that they're willing to do that for reflects them in some way. I remember being deployed when Sandy Hook happened, and we were just about to come home, and everybody that I was deployed with was like, what is going on back there? Like, I know we've been away for a minute, but like now, like, children are being killed in schools. What's happening? And so this volunteer force comes out of the people, and we want to stay connected so that there isn't that disconnect, that there is a relational understanding between the civilian society and the military society, which I think I've heard is a positive thing from everyone, that we need to have everybody understanding each other and feel ownership over the military and feel that we are connected. But I haven't really heard how the military can have that voice, how people in mid-grade level, or how do we talk to our sailors, our soldiers, our airmen? What is the right way for the military to come out and say, after George Floyd, after the photo shoot when General Milley came out and said, hey, I shouldn't have been in uniform when we happened to be going with the president, and that photo shoot happened at the protests. Because we do have people that we're leading that are affected by these things and that are part of our public. So what is the right way for the military to voice these things that's not partisan or political, but does support our people that are in the military and connect them with the country they're serving?
Yeah, wonderfully put.
I can't answer that for you, because it's actually so situationally dependent. It depends on who you're leading. It depends on what you're doing. It depends on what the issue is. For example, on school shootings, I agree they're tragedies. I'm not sure how to make American society good enough to deserve your people. And I'm worried that that's an undercurrent in that line of argument. You know, my favorite part about George Washington's response during the Newburgh conspiracy in the Revolution was that he acknowledged that Congress was terrible at their job. And yet, that's not the reason we obey them, right? And for me, I think that's the answer. I would be comfortable in talking to people who were running risks on behalf of this country full of lunatics, which is that, you know, American society's terrible at a ton of things. On its worst days, it's still worth defending, though.
Absolutely. Just to clarify, I 100% support the civilian leadership. It's more to the social media discussion of how can we, just to clarify, definitely.
that's just not an
support
easy
it, and it's
answer.
not a matter of America.
It's just not an easy answer to that.
I would just add, I look at it like kind of the way Kori just said, like it depends. I think it's very situational, and the best thing that we can do as leaders is to give, as civilian leaders, is to give the military the tools to be able to simply address it and have the conversations, and then dictate themselves what needs to happen in that particular discussion. Whenever we were looking at DOTI 1325.06, which covers political engagement, that was a part of the thought process there, is that we're trying to give leaders at the lowest level possible another tool in the toolkit because they know what's best at that particular situational step and how to engage it. And then just be as supportive as we can within reason, within the boundaries after they've properly engaged it.
So, may I say one more thing? I talked to a bunch of folks after the stand down about racism in the force. And everybody I talked to said it was awful, it was awkward, it was painful. And that's exactly the point. They would actually never have engaged any of those issues if that hadn't been required of them. And understanding just how awkward and painful and creepy trying to get your hands around a lot of this stuff is actually progress.
Yep, absolutely.
One more question, then we'll wrap up.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Mateo Caulfield. I'm a senior at Georgetown and a member of Georgetown's Army ROTC program. Thank you. We spoke, and this panel spoke on a number of ways in which senior military officials have broken norms, whether it be General Milley or Pat Donahue. I'm really interested on what we can do to better norm socialization at the beginning at those kinds of ROTC programs. And so, you know, from my experience, we had one slide on the Hatch Act my freshman year. And, you know, my thoughts are that that's probably not enough to make sure that people going into the military are well socialized to think about these issues systematically. My question for this panel is, what changes would you recommend, if any, to ROTC programs, service academies, OCS, in order to make sure that personnel are well socialized on these issues?
So many Civ Mill scholars in this room just kind of like blew up.
My friend, right off the rest of your day.
So I'd say a couple right off the bat, right? That it's easier at the service academies because we can count them on one hand. It's harder to do it at ROTC because there's so many different universities involved in small detachments. But your point is well taken, because we tend to give ourselves greater credit for how we talk about these issues than we really do. And even when we talk to, I think, some of our flag officers, they will refer back to the great instruction and discussions they've had throughout their career. And then when they think about it, it's really about capstone and pinnacle when they talk about these important things. So we can have those same discussions that Peter and Dick lead at capstone and pinnacle at junctures earlier in an officer's career. And we should even think about how we do that for non-commissioned officers too. So I think it can be done. The biggest hurdle is you have to affect organizational culture that thinks politics cannot be even spoken about within the ranks. And the first part of your step to recovery is the acknowledgement of it, right? and to get past that, and I think to start to have some better normative discussions.
I think it's definitely going to be a shift in culture, and we understand that the importance of the awkward conversation, I think, cannot be overstated. Getting people out of their comfort zones to talk about these type of topics without worrying about if they're going to get hit in some way about what they've said, as they're asking questions that they feel may be dumb or may inadvertently offend someone. Like that's an important first step in all of this. And then we've got to figure out a way to weave these types of conversations throughout the entirety of the warfighter life cycle, so to speak, in the same way that we think about ethics and we think about law, land, warfare, and these other things that are of the same, I would argue, level of importance. We have to figure out a way as to actually do that.
I think those are both great answers, and I can't improve on them.
Any closing remarks?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go right ahead. I have nothing more.
Closing remarks. Marcus Aurelius said that life is more like wrestling than dancing. If you are braced against a fall, you're less likely to experience one. And I think on all of these issues about the health of the force and civil-military relations, whether it's at the ROTC level or at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff level, reasonable people can come down in different places on these things, and having the tolerance to accept mistakes when people make them, because this is actually really hard. And to take the Lafayette Square example, that was, I think, General Milley not doing the Australian Chief of Defense trick in Lafayette Square was damaging. I think the video he made, so it's available for posterity, more than made up for that mistake. It was really important that he recentered the conversation. And so my advice to people is actually hang in there and fix it when you make a mistake. That actually matters a lot more on these issues, because we're navigating them in real time. And as Peter Feaver has said, it's like Olympic diving. You need to want a degree of difficulty factored into your score.
I would just quickly say we've seen women in combat come under fire, the policy come under fire here recently. We've seen diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives as they relate to the department come under fire. It's important for us to understand, as I alluded to earlier, that the founding of our country and the founding of the military, dating all the way back to the very beginning, was built with a variety of people, a variety of diversity, a variety of backgrounds, everything from enslaved people to free black men to women, everyone to the Europeans. Everyone took part in helping us to defend the ideal and the idea of what America stands for. So to now, in the modern day, go back and attack those very values, those very things that were foundational to the creation of our military and our country, is the antithesis of what it means to be American. It is absolutely the opposite of what we need to be doing if we're going to move forward, if we're going to continue to be competitive and continue to be a leader in our global community. So I would hope that people take that away from this discussion today.
I'm the last thing between you and lunch, so I'll just say, as a reminder for those in uniform and those who are retired from the profession, you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And so a greater recognition among all those who wear the uniform, whether they're still on active duty or they're retired, on how to best do that in a way that upholds the standards of the profession is needed. So thank you.
So thank you to our panelists, and particularly to Heidi, who's still on the job, even though the panel is over. So thank you.